Hello, and thank you for joining me today. We had so many questions, good questions asked from our Advanced Reserves Concepts question that we felt it was appropriate to spend some additional time with you. It's one thing to present a webinar, it's another thing to bring value to you and answer all your questions. So today I'll be spending a little bit of time on a number of different topics. We've grouped the questions so it makes it easier for you to follow. So I'll start out with a few questions about reserve components. First one. Infrastructure. Can you add infrastructure components without invasive inspections? That's actually an insightful question because the nature of reserve studies is a reserve study does not involve an invasive inspection, but we incorporate the invasive inspection information, the very valuable inspection information that comes from an infrastructure report prepared by a building engineer or an architect. So the components, the things that they learn, fold into the reserve study. They're incorporated into the reserve study. And that's how we get some very expert information about balcony deterioration, roof deterioration, how the boiler is doing, how the elevator is doing. All that infrastructure information is funneled in or absorbed into the reserve study. And that's how it becomes a valuable part of your budget management and cash flow plan. So the answer is yes. Infrastructure components are added to the reserve study. Can marinas appear in the reserve study? Studies about marinas, permits, dredging? Answer is yes. All of what I'm going to speak about in this section has to do with the National Reserve Study Standards 4-part test. Anything to be funded through reserves needs to pass the 4-part test, which is that the component needs to be a common area maintenance responsibility, needs to be life limited, needs to have a predictable remaining useful life, and it needs to be above a minimum threshold cost of significance to the association. So think about marinas. It's common area, let's presume it is in this case. It's life limited. You need to dredge every few years. To do that dredging, I would imagine you need permits, and so yes, and then you can see it coming. You know when it's getting time to do more dredging. And then I would imagine that dredging is a significant expense. So yes, it's likely a significant cost. It's likely a nice long cycle, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is at your particular installation. It's not just marinas. It may be water retention basins or storm runoff basins. But those kinds of things, yes, they meet the 4-part test and they should be included as a reserve component. One thing about the webinar questions is they're often very short because people are listening to the webinar and they don't type a lot. So this next one is land leases. Tell me about land leases. Well, there's 2 types of expense with land leases. One is the ongoing cost, might be the monthly lease expense, and that does not meet the National Reserve Study Standard 4-part test because it's an ongoing expense. It's multiple times per year, and so it's not the significant expense to the association. It fails test number 4. There is another lease type expense, and that's sometimes we get to a property, a client that is near the end of their lease, and they have a big buyout where they can actually buy the land and become a landholder association as opposed to a leaseholder association. That fails test number 2 because it's a one-time expense. It doesn't have a useful life cycle. So both land lease type expenses are inappropriate as a reserve expense. Structural engineer evaluations. Can you do those with reserve funds? Absolutely. In California, there's the every 9-year inspection. In New York City, there's a 5-year inspection. The 40-year inspections in Florida, Miami-Dade and Broward County, they're triggered at the 40-year point and then every 10 years thereafter. Common area maintenance responsibility to take care of the envelope of the association. Life limited, you know the cycle, you know where you are on the cycle, you can see it coming, and there's significant expenses. So yes, structural engineering evaluations, again, whether it's part of a state mandated cycle or whether it's, wow, we should get an expert looking at our balconies or our boiler or our elevator or our asphalt every few years. That's a great thing to do for your association. If it's a significant asset, by all means, get an expert to look at it and inform the reserve study of how it's doing to make sure we have the right cost factors in it and make sure we have all the line items so you can prepare for having sufficient reserves to do the projects on time to maintain the association. Next couple have to do with landscaping, greenscaping. Can we remove our turf and replace with applicable landscaping as a reserve project? Yes. As you go through that 4-part test again, you hear me say it many times, landscaping is a common area maintenance responsibility. And landscaping does get old. The turf, the vegetation, the tree trimming, things like that, they have life cycles and they're expensive. So because they have defined life cycles, you can see where you are on that cycle, and it's a significant cost. Yes, it meets the national standard 4-part test. So we have many clients with landscaping renewals on like a 20-year cycle. So it's very normal. Tree trimming, a tree removal, can we do that from reserves? Again, yes. Some associations manage their trees from their ongoing operational landscape budget. Some associations have a landscaper that just doesn't have the skill to do tree work. They're not a skilled arborist. So yes, tree trimming on every other year, every 3-year, every 4-year cycle, it's a great thing to include in your reserve budget. Otherwise, it would just be a budget buster in that 3rd or 4th year. Can we buy earthquake or other insurance through reserves? And the answer is no. The actual insurance itself is an operational running of the association. It's a business expense. It's not a common area maintenance responsibility. It's a business expense. Now, as far as should there be an earthquake or a flood or a fire or a hailstorm, can you pay the deductible from reserves? And the answer is no. Again, you don't know the timing, so it fails test number 2 and test number 3. You just don't know when it's going to happen. Unfortunately, that's going to cause likely a special assessment. But the good thing is that if your reserves are covering all your projected projects, then you are indeed left to only surprises causing a special assessment. Can you make capital improvements such as adding an electric vehicle charging station? Great idea for adding an EV charging station. That's good for the association. But think about it. Is it a common area maintenance responsibility? Well, not yet. Right now, it's just an idea. So you have to wait till it's installed to add it into the reserve fund to then replace it. Installation of a new asset is not the proper use of reserve funds. Remember, reserve funds are for caring for the property. You've set these funds aside to care and maintain the property. It's not for building up the property. That's going to take outside cash or a special assessment. For services such as tree trimming, is the time between services a determining factor, whether it's a reserve expense or not? No. If it is cyclical, if it has a defined useful life and a defined predictable replacement useful life, then it's a reserve expense. We have some clients that have some annual expenses in their reserves, and that's okay. There's no minimum number. It doesn't have to be at least 2 years. It may, in that association, be more suitable to pay the once a year tree trimming expense from reserves, because reserves are a budget that manages annual expenses, rather than your 12-month per year operating budget. Because if you pay the tree trimmer in July, then all through June, it looks like you're way ahead of budget. And you pay the tree trimmer in July, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, gee, we're over budget. And it doesn't ever balance out until December. So whether it's a reserve expense or not, if it passes the 4-part test, then it's appropriate for doing through reserves. And then there's a factor of style-wise if it boils down to an annual expense. Is there a rule of thumb for determining when an expense comes out of operations versus reserves as a cost threshold? And that is indeed test number 4. You want it to be significant to the association. You don't want to be paying for a light bulb, a sprinkler head, or a mop or a bucket from reserves. So the typical range is 0.5% to 1% of the association's annual budget, or the manager or board member's signature authority. It's something that a board member can just say to the pool service company, just buy the replacement spa motor, just buy it. Then that doesn't need to come from reserves because it's within their operational ability. You don't want to clutter up reserves with just trivia. There's a certain threshold, and that is, again, as I said, typically 0.5% to 1% of the association's annual budget, or the manager or the board's signature authority.